Good evening. I want to welcome you to our online class, First Steps 2, Tips for Successful Searches at Ancestry.com. This is the second class in our three-part First Steps series. You can watch the First Steps 1 class online at Ancestry.com by selecting Webinars from the Learning Center tab. And while you're there, register for our First Steps 3 class. Now, I'm Jeannie Crosman, and I'm going to be just your moderator tonight. Juliana Smith, editor of the Ancestry Weekly Discovery, will actually be teaching the class.
Thanks, Jeannie. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could be with us tonight. Our class, as Jeannie said, is going to be on searching for your ancestors at Ancestry.com. And I'm really excited about this class because finding a record, to me, is one of the most thrilling parts of family history. There's that incredible rush when we go out and we actually find something and learn something new about our family. It's kind of the thrill of the hunt thing. And we have so many rich records with wonderful details these days. And they're at our fingertips. So when you're using this box that you see on the home page, and you can also find this box if you click on the Search tab, this is the default box that you're going to be looking at. And when you search through this box, you're actually searching through 30,000 titles. That's 30,000 collections that include more than 6 billion records. And these records come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And that's fantastic because they all add a new element, a new piece of our family history puzzle. If they were all the same, we'd probably have a pretty one-dimensional view of our ancestors. So when we look at this sheer volume that we're looking at, the number of records and all the different elements in them, it can be a challenge to try and bring the records of your ancestor to the top. Because what Ancestry does is it takes what you enter into the search box and it looks at all these billions of records and it tries to find the pieces that match, and the best matches, we try to bring them up to the top. Your ancestor was a unique individual with unique characteristics, and searching is simply using those characteristics to bring your ancestor out of the cloud and out of the shadows and up to where we can get a clearer view. So let's take a look. What makes your ancestor unique? First of all, his name. Obviously, that's going to set him apart from other people. The places he lived, all the places, not just one or two. Maybe not if your ancestor stayed in one place, it may be just one or two, but also the events, the important dates in their life, births, marriage, deaths, the people that they were surrounded by, their family, even neighbors, friends. And you want to look at extended family too, because all these people that your ancestor interacted with may be on a record with them. So these are all clues that we can use. Now this may all sound like common sense, but it's something that we should really be thinking about when we're thinking about the records we're looking for. Which of these unique aspects is going to be in the record? And when we start thinking about it in those terms, we can start formulating searches that are going to help bring our ancestors up to the top of the pile. So let's go back to this search box. It's really pretty basic. It's going to give you, we've got a first name, a last name, we have a place that your ancestor may have lived, and an estimated birth year. And we can extend it. We can add in some of these events that we talked about, birth, marriage, death, immigration. We can add in the people that they knew. But sometimes it's best to start simple. Just a basic search with just the bare minimum. Name, residence, estimated year of birth. This is actually a search I did for my great-grandfather, Raymond Dyer, or Pops as we called him. Pops Dyer lived in Brooklyn pretty much all his life from what we knew. Okay, so I did put in Kings County, which is Brooklyn, and we also estimated his birth date. And we've got this handy little calculator. So even if you don't know exactly the dates or the years, you can kind of estimate based on the things that you do know. For example, my mom knew Pop Dyer, and she remembered that he was born, or he died when she was about 10 years old. So based on what we know about Mom, we can estimate a little bit about him. And she also remembered that he was 80 at the time. So if we can say, okay, he was 80 in 1951, we can calculate it, and this handy little calculator, we don't even have to do the math, is going to estimate for us that he was born somewhere around 1871. And in his case BASIC is very, very effective, and in a lot of cases, BASIC is going to be very effective. A lot of the census records are going to come up to the top because they include all those pieces of information that we entered, and they are things that make him unique. So you can look, I pulled out 6 of the entries that came up, and these are actually all 6 censuses that we can find him in. The 1890 census is missing because that was, most of you know, was burned in a fire in the 1920s. So, but other than that, every census he was alive for. We kind of estimated his age, but actually he was born in 1869, so we even have him here in 1870. So using all the information that we find in these censuses, because what we're going to do is we're going to click through to each and every one of these records, and we're going to look at them, and they ask all these wonderful detailed questions, and we're going to take the information we learn in them, and I'm going to show you how we can use some of those facts and tweak our searches and find even more records. Now we have some more advanced search options too, and this is, again, searching all of the records that are available on Ancestry.com. If you look in the upper corner of the search box, in the upper right corner, you'll see a little link that says Show Advanced. And now Advanced, a lot of people look at that and go, well, you know, I've only just started. I don't know if I want to go to the advanced one. That might be hard. Advanced is not hard. All that is it gives you more options, and options are good, right? So we can click through on that, and this is also available on that search tab that I also have called out. We have a lot of really neat options here. A lot of people were writing in, I noticed on Facebook where we advertised this class, and talking about common names. And common names it can be frustrating because you get a little bit overwhelmed with all the results. And you can see there's a link there by each name that says Use Default Settings. Now the default settings are kind of fuzzy. And what we're doing at Ancestry is trying to anticipate some of the problems we run into with names. Because a lot of times our ancestors' names have been misspelled, or sometimes they were indexed incorrectly, or sometimes both. So names can be a challenge. So we kind of try to make it fuzzy so that even some close matches may make their way up to the top. If all the other information, the other details that we've entered match up, it'll still bring some of those fuzzy names up to the top. But in some cases, that could be a little bit overwhelming. If you're looking for Smiths and you're getting all these different matches, fuzzy matches, we can narrow it down a little bit with some of these little functions, these little boxes. When you click on that link for Use Default Settings, these little boxes are going to open up. And you can see for a surname, we can add in Soundex, which Soundex was a system that began being used in the 1930s. And it was used to group names that sounded similarly. And there's also a phonetic, which is it's kind of a little bit extra Soundex. So play around with those two settings. So you can say, I want exact and only names that sound like it. And try either one of those settings, and you may find some different results coming up. Also, names with similar meanings. Smiths and Schmidts. Your ancestor, like my husband's Smith family was formerly Schmidt. So that changed somewhere along the line. I can use that and search for both of those. Also, there's similar choices for given names, first names, including one, and I really like that this one is on there, searching for first initial. What's going to happen is when it's weighing these things that match and things that don't match, if I click that initial, it's going to push anything. If I'm looking for James and he's listed as J, then it's going to push that up and count that as a match, if you will. And I find that a lot of times, in fact, in 1860 census records, I've noticed, especially, I don't know if it's across the country, but I noticed in the New York area, a lot of initials were used. We had some lazy census takers that didn't want to write out the full name. Some other options that are available, we can specify some of those different events that we talked about, birth, marriage, deaths, arrival dates, departure dates for immigration records, and even military service. And again, we can also use that date range and kind of put in an estimate. When you use that date range and say plus or minus 1, 2, 5, or even 10 years, with 10 years, you're actually opening up a window of 20 years. So if you can estimate pretty accurately within that 20 year, you're going to count everything in that 20 year as a match. Ancestry is going to seize that as a match and push that result up to where you want to see it. If you're really confident in it, you could even specify exact only. When you specify that, it's going to rule out any records outside of that date range. And you can add multiple events too. This is especially helpful if you wanted to add maybe a birth date and also, okay, your ancestor was born in Brooklyn in 1820 and then they moved to New York City in 1840, so you can add both of those locations. One thing to be careful about, though, is when you're specifying against. Remember how we talked about thinking about what records, what unique characteristics are going to be found in the records? Think about a death date. When you put in a death date, how many records include a death date? Usually only death records, right? An exception to that would be trees. If you're looking for an online tree, somebody might have a death date included in that tree. And there may be some other smaller exceptions, but for the most part, the records your ancestor left behind were created while he or she was alive. So you're not going to find that death date. So when you put that in, Ancestry is going to see that and go, well, that doesn't quite match. So it might nudge that result down a little bit. So I don't like to specify a death date unless I'm looking for the death-related record or a tree. If you specify exact, when you put in a death date and you say, I want exact matches only to this, that's going to actually rule out some records that you might be missing out on. In fact, here's the search for Raymond Dyer, that same one we did where we found all those wonderful census records. I included a death date this time, and I clicked exact, and now all the census records are gone. All we have are the trees and some pictures that we've added to the tree. So you can see how that can kind of throw your results. So it's always good to think about what types of records am I looking for, what kind of information would I expect to find in those records. Excuse me. And Ancestry actually does a little bit of that filtering for you. We're gonna kind of predict a time frame for your ancestor through what we call lifespan filtering. So if you entered only a birth year, we're going to assume that that person lived about 100 years. That's probably a wider window, but we want to err on the side of caution. The records returned are going to include a birth year minus 5 years, because we know our ancestors weren't always careful with those ages, and birth dates plus 102 years. So we're going to give you this nice wide window, but you don't want to have an ancestor you're searching for that was born in 1800 and then have a bunch of records from the 1940s come up for him, cluttering up your search, or the 1930 census, unless, of course, he was in the Guinness Book of World Records. Excuse me. So entering only a death date, we're going to do kind of the same thing. We're going to assume they lived about 100 years, but we'll go backwards. We're going to take the death year minus 105 years and then plus 2 years. And don't worry about trying to write all this down. This is all in the handout that Jeannie mentioned. So if you go back to that reminder email for coming in today, you'll see the link to that handout, and I've put all of this information in there. If you enter both a birth date and a death year, you're going to have minus 5 years from the birth year and plus 2 from the death. And, of course, you can always still add in the wiggle room if you think your ancestor lived to a ripe old age. And you can add in plus or minus however many years you feel comfortable with. And it's just going to do the same as above, and it'll tack on those years that you've specified. So we do a lot to really give you some room and estimate, because estimating is very powerful when it comes to searching. We also have some location options that you might want to look into. You can search for the default is going to give you fuzzy. It's going to bring the closest places to your ancestor up top, but it's also going to bring in some other records where places that you don't know about that your ancestor lived. But in some cases, I've actually found that I find my ancestor in unexpected places. We have one ancestor who showed up in Idaho in 1910, and we had no idea he had gone there from New York City. So it's always good to look through those other places and see if you got some close matches. But we can also whittle that down. We can select this place exactly, and if we go and we start entering in the place name in that place field, when you start typing along, it's going to bring up a drop-down menu of places that we've already populated that include the county and the state, and you can choose from that list. And if you choose from that list, you're going to have these last 5 options at the bottom, which are really helpful. You can search for exact and only in that county. So maybe you have a town name, a small town, but he lived outside the town, just outside the town in, a rural area. And if you search on that county level, you may find him then. You may also find that maybe he lived near a county border, or maybe he moved to the other county. So you may want to search that county and adjacent counties. Or you can search that state or an adjoining state. Perhaps your ancestor lived near a state boundary, and you may want to look in both places because you don't know exactly where he lived. So this is a great way to kind of start your search narrow and then widen it gradually until you find your ancestor. And you're not getting overwhelmed with all those hits from other states. And you can even enter in multiple locations. Maybe you have an ancestor who spent some time in New York and decided to take up farming in Indiana. So you could add in New York and Indiana using that lived-in event. And what's going to happen is going to return you hits from both of those states. And also, one of the other characteristics we talked about was family members, particularly in census records. Beginning in 1880, we start seeing the census asking for relationships. And so if we start entering in people that we expect to find in the household with them, we can start that's going to help bring up, really helpful when you're looking at common surnames. I'm going to show you an example of how powerful this can be when you're searching in a little bit. A couple things to note on the search box. Down towards the bottom of the search box, we have a little box for collection priority. Now, normally that's going to default to all collections, or it may have, you may be defaulting to U.S. if you have a U.S. membership and you're focused on the Ancestry.com site. So you're going to see that United States. Now, one thing to note about that is that that box is sticky. So whatever it says in that box when you leave the site today, when you come back next week, it's going to say that again. So if you decide to work on the Canadian branch of your family and you specify, okay, I don't want to see all these U.S. records, just show me Canadian, and then you come back next week, that's still going to be there. So when you start working on your U.S. branch of the family, you're going to want to go in and change that collection priority. And you can specify that if you check that little black or the little box at the bottom, it's going to say only return records from this collection. So you're really limiting yourself that way. So that's something to check if you find that you're not getting the results that you expect. Also, you can also restrict your search to a certain record type. If you want to only look at historical records, you're not interested in trees and photographs and things like that right now, at this point in your research you're focusing on the records, you can restrict your research to that. Or maybe you're just looking for that long-lost photograph of great-grandma. You just restrict your search to just photographs, and that's going to bring all those records up to the top. But again, this is another field that's sticky, so it's going to stay that way until you change it back. One last thing I wanted to point out while we're talking about the global search and the search results is the results view. Now, the view that we saw with the tree and all those census records that came up is actually sorted by relevance, which is what I was talking about, where we take all the information that you've provided and we try to bring all the best matches to the top. And when we do that, you're seeing all these top matches at the beginning. But sometimes, as I mentioned, the census records are the ones that seem to really rate high because they include so many details. So a lot of other records may be getting buried beyond this page. Another thing we can do is click where we have that drop-down menu and view our results by category. And when you're looking at them, now you're still going to see some fuzzy search results. Remember, we take into account a lot of different things, all the pieces of information. So you may see some hits that aren't quite dead on. But what's really helpful about this is you get to see a list by collection. So you get a good idea of what collections are out there. You may see a collection here that while your ancestor is not ranking high and it's not coming up to the top of the page, you think, hey, my guy is probably in this one. And then you can click through to that link and go search it directly and really work that database and get your ancestor to come out. And also, this is really, I like using this one for census records. If I'm missing my ancestor in a few censuses after I've, viewed that main thing of results, maybe for some reason he didn't show up in 1880, I can go to this view, pull up the 1880, and then use that search form to try and bring them up to the top. Another great thing to do is to search on a category level. We have different categories of records. Immigration records are a category. Census records are a category. Military. And we've grouped them like that because a lot of the content in those collections is going to be somewhat similar. So we can do a little better job on focusing that search form and targeting what we need. And you can access the different categories by either clicking on the search tab and going straight to that page. All the categories will be listed there. Or from the home page, you can just hover over that search menu, and a lot of our the bigger, more popular categories are there. And also I wanted to point out that little link in the upper right, customize your home page. One of the options is to add record collections to your home page on Ancestry. And you'll see these nice links to all the categories and all the census years there. I really like having that feature available to me. It allows me to hop right to what I need. So again, the advantages of searching on the category level, first of all, you're narrowing the focus. If you're looking for an immigration record and all these census records are coming up to the top, you got to kind of wade through them and find what you're looking for. This lets you narrow your focus and go right to what you want to find. It's also, again, customized fields. We've added fields for an arrival date and for a departure date. That would be departing the home country. Or in some cases we may have lists of people leaving, but those are more international. But this is all information. Mostly what you're going to see is that arrival date. And you could even put in, if you knew the ship name that your ancestor traveled in, you could put that in as well. So that we can use that in the keyword. And that'll help you narrow your search. And we can even go into subcategories. Within immigration, for example, we've got passenger list as a subcategory. We also have citizenship and naturalization records as a category. Border crossings and passports is another one. So these are all little subcategories that are going to even let us get a little closer to the data that we're looking for. If we're looking for that arrival record, which is so wonderful to have, we could search all of the passenger lists on Ancestry.com through this. And you could even go through and search by port. For example, my great-grandfather, my grandfather had told me his father came in through New York. He had come in through Ellis Island. And so as soon as those records became available, I ran out, got that record, found him coming in through New York on the steamship Castle in October of 1902. So yay, got his arrival record. I was all happy. Now, had I been able to search all of those records, I might have found something else, because a little while later, I noticed in the 1920 census, the 1920 census actually lists the naturalization, the date of immigrants were naturalized, if they were naturalized. It also gives their naturalization status. So if you see an AL there, that would mean that they had not been naturalized. But I saw that he was naturalized, and so I went out and got his naturalization record. And you can see he's arriving on the castle, but what we don't see, or when I read on further, it says he arrived at the port of Baltimore in July of 1902. So I kind of did a double take, and I went back, and sure enough, I found him coming in through Baltimore in 1902 on the castle again, but it was in July. And so this was actually his first arrival in the country. The one through New York was his second trip. And I never knew that. And what really makes this record special to me is just below him is Andras Skokhan, who is going to be his brother-in-law. The next year in 1903, he married Andrew's brother Teresa. And in fact, this is them in the picture here. That's Andrew is the one sitting off to the left, and then Janos and Teresa are sitting there with my grandpa on his lap, or on her lap. So. And always is a good idea to keep in mind that your ancestor may have made several trips. And by searching in that subcategory level, you're going to capture, hopefully, all of the different arrivals of your ancestor. And this isn't just an isolated incident in my household. My paternal, actually it was my grandmother's parents, the same thing happened with her father. I actually have 4 passenger arrivals for him. He went back and forth a number of times before he finally settled down here. So it's something to consider. Another way to get closer to the records, because a lot of times it's really helpful when we're to get all the way on to a database collection level, the individual collection level. And so we want to find the collections that are going to be important to your family and that are going to include your ancestors. The best way, I think, to do it is to look by location, because most records were created in the places where your ancestor lived. So if you know where your ancestors live, we can look by location. And you can see here, you can search the card catalog with that top box there. And if you search the title field, like I did here, I've included Vermont. And you can see that all the records here include Vermont in the title, because I'm doing a title search. Now, this is good, especially if you want to look for statewide collections, but sometimes you're going to miss a few things. For example, there are some collections of New England records, and they're not, if it says New England marriages, for example, you're not going to see Vermont in the title. So that's not going to come up on a title search. So you could do a keyword search, and what that will do is search both the title and the descriptive materials. So you'll be able, if it says New England marriages include records from Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, etc., those are going to pull up because it's going to see Vermont in the description. And an even better way is to just forget the search and use the filters just below the search box. Now, these filters are going to allow you to filter by location, so you're also getting that location. But all these collections are tagged for the different places that they pertain to. And so you can see that I've filtered now by U.S., Massachusetts, and I can also even go down to the collection type. So I can say, okay, let's see what kind of vital records we have for Massachusetts, what birth, marriage, and death. And I've even whittled this down to which marriage and divorce records we have for that state. So this is really helpful, and in fact, you could even add in, just below this, you can't see it because the screen's cut off, but you can add in a time frame, either a century or a decade, and narrow the search even more. And you could even go down to a county level and find out what's available for Barnstable County in Massachusetts. So there's a lot of different things you can do with these filters, and this is a great way to explore the collections on Ancestry.com. And before we leave the screen, I also want you to notice, you see at the top of the green bar where it says Sort By? This one, the default view is sort by popularity. So it's going to take the most popular collections and bring them to the top, because those are the collections that our members find most valuable. You could also sort by record count, look for the largest collections. But another helpful thing is once you've gone in and kind of familiarized yourself with the records that are available for the place, you're going to want to come back periodically and do this again, because more records are being added all the time. And while we try to keep you up to date with newsletters and everything, sometimes some are going to get by. So what you can do is sort by recently updated or recently added collections. And what that'll do is bring the records for for your ancestors' location, the newest ones that have been added to the site up to the top, and you can see if we've added something new for your ancestors. Another place to get familiar with the records that we have available are state pages. If you click on the Search tab on that top navigation bar, you're going to see a lot of the different categories of records, but in the lower left corner, you're also going to find this little map. And you can see there are tabs above it where we have different countries, so if you want to explore our international collections, you can look through there. You can click on a state, and that's going to take you to a page like this one for Rhode Island, where it shows what records we have available, what censuses, and they're broken down by categories, and we've already pulled the most popular ones up to the top of the list. If you want to, or you're interested in all the records on a particular category, you can click on that bottom link that says View All, and then you'd look at all the different ones. Also, over on the right side, you can see we can also narrow down by county there. And this is really helpful in some of the collections that don't really rise to the top as easily. Some of the collections are a little bit harder to search through a global when you're working with so many records. For example, the stories, memories, and histories. We have a lot of really rich local histories, and even there may even be a family history about your family that's been published. But you won't know it if you're just doing it through a global search, because typically the way these are formatted, they're books, and you're going to see them written in book form. And you may pick up a name, but it's not going to have a field for this guy, this birth date, this place where he lived. It's more of a abstract thing. So you're going to want to have to look through this collection and browse through it. And when you once you locate the collection, if you search for your ancestor's name, then you're going to find him. But he's not going to rise to, this type of hit isn't going to rise to the top of the global search results. So that's why it's really important, because these can include some incredible details about your family. And even if your family is not mentioned, you can find stories about the town that they lived in, the events, the different things that happened in that town, and things that impacted your family but aren't going to get mentioned in a history book. So I really encourage you to look through. This is down towards the bottom of that page we just saw for Rhode Island. You'll see these memories and stories, memories, and histories category, and a lot of great information there. This is when we click to view all of the records. So, and you could go through, again, by county, narrow it down to a county level, see if there are any county histories for your ancestors' location. So searching directly, now that we've familiarized ourselves with the collections that are available, there are some benefits to searching a collection directly. I use the 1900 census year as an example because it's particularly rich. We include marriage, they asked for marriage information in the 1900 census. And so we've made that marriage year searchable. The immigration year is searchable. Because that's included in the censuses for 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930. If you read through those records, you're going to find that they asked for the year of immigration, naturalization status, and as I mentioned in 1920, they also asked for the year of naturalization for those that were naturalized. With censuses, you're also going to have the family members that are living in the house and their relationships. When you're working with common surnames, knowing if you know a sibling's name, that can help bring them up to the top, a parent's name. Marital status, even something as simple as that. Or parents' birthplaces. Beginning in 1880, we started seeing parents' birthplaces being mentioned. So we could, if we know where the parents were born, we can start adding in, okay, I know my ancestor was John Smith from Kentucky. He was born in Kentucky, and I know his parents were born in Illinois and Indiana. So if you enter that in, that's really going to narrow your search in the John Smiths. Another reason to go right to the database page is one that a lot of people don't think of. And it's kind of like, if I really want to read the description, it's kind of like reading the instructions before you start a project. You don't really want to do it, but it really can be beneficial. First of all, the source information is something we should know. We always want to know where our records are coming from. I mean, yes, we know they came from Ancestry.com, but where did Ancestry.com get them? This is going to tell you. This came from the Maine Department, this is Maine Marriages, and they came from the Maine Department of Health. In addition, you're going to learn a little bit about the data coverage. Unfortunately, at times, records get lost. Sometimes courthouse burns, records just are omitted from a collection for whatever reason. And in this case, that is the case. And you can see where I've called out there's some missing years in this collection. You want to know that. Especially if your ancestor, you think they were born within that time span. You don't want to beat your head up against a wall looking for them, and it turns out those years are missing. So good to know. Next steps. Whenever you see the word index, you always want to go, hey, how do I get the original? And a lot of times what we're trying to do is include the information for you so that you don't have to run around looking for, okay, where's the original kept? We're going to include the address, and in this case, we even include a link to the website. And also search tips. This is what I found for some Ohio death records. And you can see there's some scattered years. But something that's really important here, it says that this index that was created by the Ohio Department of Health, they truncated the names. They only included 7 letters of the first name. So if you have an ancestor who was Catherine or Cornelius or some other name that's longer than 7 letters, when you do your search for them, you're going to want to cut that off at 7 letters because that's all that was included in this index. Also, we're going to include links to other collections. If you found your ancestors in this Bremen, Germany ship's crew list from 1850 to 1917, you're probably going to want to look at that ship's the sailor's registry from 1837 to 1917. So covering roughly the same time frame, we have another collection that may include more details. So we've cross-linked these collections so when you find one, you can find the other. And also, when you're talking about international records, we've set up some research centers. They're going to have some translation guides for you and things like that that are going to help you understand the records and interpret them. Just a quick cert tip. Sometimes we get stuck when we're talking about surnames. We get hung up on that name, and you can't find them and can't find them. That happened to my Uncle Bruce. He was looking for his family in the 1930 census, so he asked if I could help him. And so what I did was he knew they lived in Canton. He knew his brother was alive at the time, was living with the parents. So what I did was I put in just Charles, just the county where they live, Stark County, Ohio, just father's name, first name Henry, and mother's first name Mary. No last name at all. And as you can see from this, that was actually the first hit on the page. It turned out their last name was Barnby. And what happened was it had been transcribed as Barnes. I guess that was a variant that they used sometimes. And then on top of that, the guy had really bad handwriting, and it was interpreted as Bamer. So you can see where these names that get twisted, sometimes you just don't need them. In the 1930 census, there were a lot of people in that census. So to be able to find people, that goes to show you how powerful just searching on family structure can be. Some other things we can do to defeat those problems with the names are using wildcards. Ancestry.com does allow wildcards, and in fact, an asterisk is going to match 0 or more characters. So Ann with an asterisk at the end is going to match A-N-N, Ann. Ann with an E at the end, Anna, Annabelle, or if you have an Annabella Bella, that's the name of my greyhound, that would be included too. So you could use that asterisk there, or you could use a question mark, and that matches one character. So that's going to match Ann with an E or Anna. It's important to note that it's not going to include an A-N-N because there has to be one character there. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind. If there may not be a character, you might want to go with that asterisk, a little more flexible. Also, we've improved the wildcard searches now. You can now use a wildcard in place of the first letter. And that's important because SoundX codes keep that first letter in there. So if that first letter is misinterpreted, SoundX algorithms aren't going to pick that up, those things where the first letter is. So using a wildcard for the first letter is really big. The two things you have to know, though, is either the first or last character must be a non-wildcard character. Also, names are going to have to include at least 3 non-wildcard characters. They tell me this will blow up the internet if we let everybody put all wildcards. So, not really, but it would definitely slow things down. So another thing that we're trying to do is trying to call out some records that may be associated. When you interact with a record, we're trying to not only connect you with other members, but maybe connect you with records that other members have attached to their tree. So if you found this record for William Dennis and you think this is your ancestor, wouldn't you be interested to know if someone else has attached this record to their tree, what other records have they found? So now we're giving you a list of some suggested records. And we use some algorithms that may indicate other likely matches. It may not necessarily be something someone else has attached. But it's going to give you some ideas for some other records that might be yours as well. And this is a little section I like to call troubleshooting, also known as don't do what I do. Because no matter how many years I've been at this, there are some mistakes that I continue to make over and over again. First of all, check the fields that you're using closely. And this is one that I used to do a lot more often than I do now. But I used to always go in and enter in, I would enter in the birth date, and then I would enter in a place where they lived instead of the birthplace. So my Irish immigrant ancestor, I'd go, okay, born 1896, New York, Kings, because that's where they were. And I wasn't thinking birthplace. Since they've added those event fields, that's helped me a little because I have to actually specify birth, so it kind of makes me remember, oh, that's where they were born. So that's something to kind of double check. If you're not getting the results, make sure you're, not thinking ahead. Sometimes we get so excited we don't think about what we're putting in. Also, clear the form before you're starting a new search. I like to hit that back button. And I go back, and then I want to search for another ancestor, and I've hit that back button, and I've left in somebody else's date of birth when I go to switch people. So important to make sure if you're going to start a new search, clear the form. There's a little link at the top of the search form that just says clear form. That way you'll make sure you always got a fresh start. Check for that stickiness that we talked about earlier. And also, something that I like to do is go in, especially if you're working with a collection you're not familiar with. You're looking at some military records or some other. Sometimes you don't really know what's in them, and how you can kind of tweak your search. Look at what we've indexed. How are places listed? Are they giving a month, a date? Just a year? So you can kind of look, is the state just given? Sometimes that'll help pull your hits up a little bit. If you're looking on for a birthplace, for example, in the census, if you're going to enter in Chicago, Cook County for the birthplace, it may not see that as close of a match as Illinois, which is what's listed in the census. So you may want to tweak that, play around with that a little. And that's what's really cool about this, is you just get to play around with it. You can't break it. You just have fun. Eventually you're going to hit on that magic combination and find something cool. A couple other considerations that sometimes we don't think about, especially with immigrants. Ethnic given names. If you're looking for your immigrant ancestor, they may, especially in immigration records, they probably didn't come over using their English name. They're going to be coming over for non-English speaking ancestors. They're going to come over with an ethnic variation of their name. This is my great-grandfather, John Mikowski, and he's listed as J-A-N, John. And you can find some ethnic variants at BehindTheName.com. That's a really good resource for that. Also, just do a search for Polish given names or German given names. You're going to find some websites that are going to help you out as well. Also look into surname variants. There may be, with my Polish ancestors, I've found a bunch. These are some of the variants that Jaja used. For my grandma always went with the Mikowski spelling, and then I found a picture of Jaja's father, and he had the Mikala spelling. Jaja, however, went with Menkowski, and I couldn't figure that out for a long time until I figured out with that E with the little tail on it actually makes an EN sound. So that kind of explained to me why we have these variant spellings. And the Menkowska is actually the spelling his sister used because that SKA is a feminine ending. So she went by that. So this is definitely a case for wild cards if there ever was one. Also, Jaja complicated things a little further because for a while he spelled his name Wagner. So he just decided he couldn't get work. They weren't hiring Poles at the time where he was living, and so since he spoke German, he told them his name was John Wagner, and he went and applied for a job, got a job that way. And for more than 10 years, the records I find for him are all listed under Wagner, including some of him going back and forth to Poland. So it's something to consider. They didn't always go into a court of law and say, change their name. And in fact, then when World War I broke out, he decided he didn't want to be German anymore, so he went back to his Polish name. So they make things interesting for us. So just a couple things to consider. Using what you know. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with trees because they're so wonderful for organizing all the information we find, but we're putting all these clues into this little electronic place that they can't get out of. So we really have to pull out the records. And next week we're actually going to have another class that's going to delve into this a lot more, using what we know and how to really bring together all the clues that we find in these wonderful records. But one of the ways I like to do this is through timelines or chronologies. And you can see that, like from census records, I found Mary Kelly was born in Ireland somewhere around 1817. Her sister Jane was born in New York. Now, she was a little one of those ones that wasn't real careful with the ages, so it could have been 1819 or 1822 or 1825, depending on which record you want to believe. But even still, having that window of knowing which child was born in Ireland when and which one was born in New York, I'm narrowing that immigration window to about 8 years, and that's significant. So go in and pull all the clues you find in these records out and start bringing them together in some type of form. And while the trees actually do have somewhat of a chronology and they're helpful in some ways, we've got to kind of go in there and really work that information to be able to come up with these other, conjectures, if you will. A couple other tips. Search for extended family. Extended family, you never know. Great-grandma might be living with your cousin or your ancestor's cousin. Grandma might be with a sibling. So you want to make sure, in the old days we used to have to go through things, it was a very manual process going through all these census records, rolls and rolls of microfilm. Now we can do it a lot easier, so we really can benefit from this technology by searching wide, and we can learn a lot more about the extended family structure, which was really important to our ancestors. Also, look for neighbors. That one year, the one census year in 1910 where my Mikowskis were enumerated as Wagner, there were a couple inconsistencies. But my grandma had told me a story about how when she was little, Mrs. Glass used to take care of them when her mom had died or when she got sick. And so I remembered that story, and I went and looked for them in 1910, and when I found this entry that was kind of off, I scrolled a couple pages before, and there was Mrs. Glass. Actually, she was on the page before, just a few doors down. So that story and knowing that neighbor, Mrs. Glass. But also keep an eye on the neighbors. If you see neighbors that maybe are next-door neighbors in one census, and the next one they're living in the same household, the same dwelling, that could be a relative, so it's important to pay attention to that type of thing. Browse around and explore your ancestors' neighborhood, and then expand your horizons. I found one great-grandfather who was living in Idaho in 1910. We had no idea he had left for a while, and he just decided to take off and move to Iowa for a while. And so the only way we found him was by going in and expanding our horizons and looking at for all the George Dennises who matched that description. So you really want to use these records you found to the fullest. They include the stories of our ancestors. These are where all the really cool details about our families are found. And I hope you'll join us again on March 9th. And this is going to be an afternoon class. If you can't make the afternoon class, it will be available in the archive shortly afterwards. But we're going to talk about some other ways that we can really use these records we found to the fullest and pull those stories, those wonderful stories of our family out. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. Jeannie?
That's right, Julie. We do have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to tell you that was a fantastic presentation, and we have so many questions. For everybody whose questions we don't get to tonight, please remember that you can rewatch tonight's online class. You will be receiving an email that tells you when it's available for viewing online. You may also find answers in our Learning Center through the other webinars that we have, or the other online classes that we have, including our First Steps #1 as well as First Steps 3, which Julie referred to earlier as the class that she'll be teaching again or teaching next week. So definitely check there. And really quickly before we get to some questions, I did want to remind you to stick around after the question and answer, because we will be having put out a little survey, very short survey, but your feedback is super important to us and helps us make sure that all of these online classes are meeting your needs. Okay, Julie, I'm going to get straight into the question, and I'm starting off with just two that I think are absolutely fabulous, because this is the kind of thing that happens in my own family all the time. The first question is, in one census, my mother Helen was listed as Allen, and then to follow that up with someone else's, how can you match people up when they have a mixed up last name or a bad spelling or something like that? Julie, what do you do in that situation? How do you find Helen when she's listed as Allen?
Well, that happens a lot more than you'd like, but there are a lot of, fortunately, especially some of the more robust censuses, there are a lot of other details, and that's why it's really important to create a profile, gather all those unique characteristics we talked about of your family, and you're going to kind of build up a case, a little bit of, gather this evidence, if you will, and start saying, okay, this matches up, this matches up. Why might that have been wrong? It could have been that the census taker just misunderstood. Another thing to consider, too, is some of the censuses that we have that we're using are copies that were actually made on the local level. They would make a copy of the census, and then somebody else would transcribe it, and then they would send the copy to Washington, D.C. So in some cases, we may be looking at a copy of the census, and whenever a copy is made, errors can be introduced. So you want to look around, look for other census records, try and find that same family in other records. Start branching out into other types of records, vital records, and start building your case that, yes, this is your ancestor, because everything else fits, and it's understandable that sometimes the names get mixed up.
Now, speaking of names, let's go with middle names. If you know a middle name, should you include that in a search?
You can. I usually leave them out at the beginning, and as I said before, start wide with just the basics, and then if you're seeing too many results, you can start whittling it down with that. I would also recommend a middle initial, too, because a lot of times you'll see William H. Dennis listed in a census like we did in that one, as opposed to William Henry.
All right. Now, this is a question that I know definitely is near to me. My ancestors came from Austria, but the borders of their country changed a lot during the World Wars. What's going to be the best way to find them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, that's happened in my family as well. Really learning a little bit about history. Look around for some historic maps dated from the times when your ancestors lived there. And also look for maps at the time the census was created. Sometimes, for example, my Hungarian ancestors, the county where they lived was actually, with the border changes, became Czechoslovakia in 1930. So when I look at a 1930 census, they gave Czechoslovakia as their place of origin. So you might want to look for, if you're missing your ancestor in a census year and you're using that place, look and see where your ancestors were, or the area they were from, whether that was in. And you may have to try, if you don't know the exact location, just knowing which parts of if parts of the country became a new country, what countries they were. Try plugging them in. But knowing a little bit of history and looking for historical maps is really helpful in that instance.
Now, aside from people whose names were maybe put down wrong on the census or something, but if there are known variations to an ancestor's name, how can you figure out what some of those are?
What the known variations are?
Yeah, what some of the known variations are, yes.
You'll find in different records, and sometimes, in fact, you'll find different siblings use different variations. They began trying to separate themselves from the rest of the family. My husband's family is all Pennsylvania Dutch, and they had some Grunzweigs. And it seems like different generations became green or Greenzweig at different times, and then some became green. And even in different records they varied. So sometimes it was a gradual process, and that's to our benefit. Because if they did it gradually, you may find a couple things and you could say, okay, this is the same person even though they have the different names like we talked about before, by comparing all the other characteristics. Family stories are also really helpful. Really ask whoever you have in your family, are there any other surnames that people took on? If you look at last week's Discovery, I actually wrote an entire article on name changes and things like that. It's the one that went out on Sunday, the 27th. If you go to the Learning Center and click on the article archives, you'll find that article. And there are a lot of different ideas on why people's names change. Sometimes you'll find that people, if a parent died, if the father died, I have two instances where the father died and the children took on the stepfather's name. So a lot of different things could come into play with that. Really just be thorough, research all the different members of the family, and look for any clue you can. And especially if you have any family that's still alive, ask them about it.
Now let's say I know my ancestors were in a specific state. Is there a way I can just look at census records for one state?
Yes, you can. You can go in. We actually have a browse function. If they lived in a rural area, you might want to even consider browsing. If you look on go to the individual censuses, you can go to the census year, and up on the right corner, you'll see a browse menu. You can browse to the state, browse to the county and a town or township, and sometimes it's quite manageable to browse to your ancestors' entry if they lived in a smaller area, more rural place. You can also specify that type of information in your search. If you're searching for the 1900 census, specify that location, and then remember how I showed you could open up click that Use Default Settings link, and then you can pick, specify, do I want to search that exact and only that county, or exact and only that state, or maybe that county and adjoining counties. So that's a way that you can really focus your search.
Okay, now what about initials? Because I have a question about a great-grandfather being listed by only initials in the census. Tried to put the correct name in, but she can't find him anywhere other than in one census. It's like he disappeared. Do you have any good suggestions for what she can do, Julie?
Again, look at all the family members, see if you can find, if they were all listed with initials, that's tough. I actually have Kelly family in New York City, and it was only by knowing the entire family structure that I was able to identify them. And then you're going to have to kind of fill out using other records. Try to look for other records in that location that have people, look for some common names. If you're looking for J such and such, try searches for James such and such in that area with all the same matching criteria, the same age, same birthplace. Try looking for John. Try, any type of name. You might have to do a lot of hit or miss. That's a really good question, and it's going to be a little bit of a search for you. But again, play around with the different things and make sure you read every record, print them out, and extract every detail. Because using all those details that you have, all the other details, like we did with that search for my uncle's family. Sometimes, if you use all the pieces around that one piece that's missing, you're going to be able to help find them.
All right. Now, sometimes I get an error message because it asks me to narrow my search, even though I've done just about everything I can think of to restrict what I'm looking for. What's going on?
An error message. Is it saying that you're not getting any results? Because if that's the case, what may be is it's not so much that you haven't entered enough, is that maybe you're entering too much. Sometimes when you put in too much information, if we can't find anything, you're going to get that. And it also, if you're specifying exact, remember when you specify exact, you're telling Ancestry.com, only give me exactly this. So you're really limiting yourself a little bit. I would take off the exact on maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 fields. And that's the great thing about the advanced search. You can kind of play around with that exact. Think about the things that are most likely to be correct. Mark those exact. But other things, make sure you leave them funny, because remember, those records are not always going to be exactly as we expect them. I always start fuzzy and then start narrowing a little bit if I'm getting overwhelmed with results. Start fuzzy, start basic. My rule of thumb.
All right, and Kimberly is looking for a relative who was an actor in the 1860s. Where should she start?
Well, the 1880 census is the only one that actually, if they were still around in 1880, you might want to try that census and use that actor as the occupation. I believe that's the only one that is actually searchable by occupation, because that field was indexed. That might be something, but you're still going to have a 20-year gap. Again, though, I would take all the details you find in that 1880 census and use them to formulate a search of just that census, or the 1870, just the 1860 census. Take them back a step at a time. So hopefully, if your ancestor was alive in 1880 and you can use that actor as an occupation, you might be able to find them that way. But I would definitely, go back slowly in time, decade by decade in the census, and then print out each record, look for every clue. Parents' place of, well, you're not going to be able to search in 1860 for a parent's place of origin, because that wasn't one of the questions that was asked. But age, birthplace, those type of things, you definitely want to include all of that and see if you can narrow down your search.
And Julie, I'm going to hit us up with one last question, and it's: is there anything special I need to do if I'm searching for African American ancestors?
Well, up till 1870, you're going to pretty much be following the same path that everyone else is. Once you get to the 1860 census, it gets a little more difficult. Again, glean every clue out of those records. Your next steps are in those records. So the more you can glean out of the records that you find, the better off your chances are. I would also recommend visiting our African American collection. If you go to the Ancestry.com search tab, down in the lower right corner of the page, there's a link to the African American collection. And you can go in there and find links to a lot of our more popular African American related databases. There's some great tips for you there. Best of luck with your search.
Hey, Julie, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for your presentation tonight, and I want to thank everybody for coming as well.
Enjoy, and good luck with your search.